Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our event entitled Equity and Ethics, Clinical Trials and Practical FDA Guidance Prep, sponsored by H1. I'm Jessica D'Amico, an editor with First Word Pharma, and I'll be your host during today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll address as many of those as we can at the end. Also, during today's discussion, we'll be posing a few live audience poll questions. These will appear on your screen, and you can simply click to answer, and we will review the results in real time. Finally, at the end of the presentation, please take the time to complete our short survey. We always appreciate your feedback. Now, let's get started. So the FDA will soon be issuing new guidance for the industry about improving the enrollment of clinical trial participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations, many of whom are part of medically underserved communities. Improving diversity in pharma will in turn improve overall patient outcomes. In this fireside chat, Ryan Brown with H1, fresh off the latest FDA guidance, is going to examine different paths to get there with our other industry experts. We're going to explore a few key points. First, the role of social determinants of health and diversity metrics in building diversity and equity in trials. Second, how trust plays a critical role in patient access and ensures inclusive and equitable trials for drug development. And third, where and how to begin to build diverse and tech-enabled trials. So let's take a moment first to meet our panelists. As mentioned, we have Ryan Brown, Regional Vice President of H1, Tanea Gray, Executive Director and Global Head of Diversity and Clinical Trials at ICON, and Bill E. Fitzsimmons, a board member at the Carer Group, a 501c3 nonprofit and founder of Tutela Pharmaceuticals. Could each of you just take a moment to tell us a little more about your role and the work you're doing? Let's start with Ryan.
Good morning, Jessica and fellow panelists. My name is Ryan Brown, and I serve as the Regional Vice President of Trial Landscape here at H1. What that means, Trial Landscape is an innovative product that looks at various data sets and tries to connect the world's doctors with the right sites, the right patients at the right time. And it's got a unique edge with a lens of social determinant insights powered by tremendous claims information. My background is that spanning a lot in the clinical research organization, so CRO world for many, many years in various roles from operations to commercial groups. Most recently, I was working for a site network and spent some time working also with decentralized clinical trials. All of these experiences are fueled by my personal passion, given my personal experiences with clinical trials. And so really pleased to be here today. And I like dispelling the myth that people of color don't want to participate because I've got firsthand experience.
Fantastic. Okay, Tanea, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Tanea Gray. As you heard, I am our Global Head of Diversity and Clinical Trials at ICON, leading CRO in industry. My remit within ICON is the architect and leader of our end-to-end diversity and clinical trial solutioning, accountable for the development of our strategic and operational capability to deliver inclusive trials and to achieve representative population, leveraging the best of ICON and beyond to do so. Like Ryan, I have a personal passion for this work as I spent 3 decades of community work, mostly focused in anti-poverty, racial injustice reform. In addition, I've been in industry for 25 plus years in roles both in strategic development and early development, including complex conditions in both pharma and the CRO sectors. Combined with my personal passion, this opportunity to broaden clinical trial access to more populations and centering patients in this way was ideal. So happy to be here.
Great. We're thrilled to have you. Now, Bill?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm Bill Fitzsimmons. I'm a pharmacist by training. I spent most of my career in the pharmaceutical industry at Astellas Pharma, where I was in clinical development and led the Global Regulatory Affairs Group. After retiring from Astellas, I've been working on a number of not-for-profits, including the Carer Group that Jessica mentioned. CARE was started in 2022, 2 years ago, as a 501c3, a group of biopharmaceutical professionals who were particularly interested in enhancing equity in healthcare. And it stands for catalyzing access to research and equity in representation. Our first work has really focused on clinical trials, and we've developed a scorecard for assessing all the novel new drugs approved by the FDA to assess their adequacy and grade them in terms of their representation of both of age, race, ethnic, and racial groups, and sex as well in that scorecard. So thank you for your willingness to participate today in the webinar, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. All right, let's dive in. Now, Ryan, I understand you recently attended the workshop where the FDA detailed their new guidelines. What are some of the latest developments there?
Absolutely, Jessica. So I think some of the things that we could take note of from the recent workshop is that the FDA is kind of taken and looks like a page out of some of the recent discussions from the MHRA, where they're starting to look at things in a broader scope beyond just looking at diversity as far as race and sex. Some of the topics that were on the docket were looking at diversity in the sense of disability status, right? And folks that had intellectual or developmental disabilities, people with mental illness, and looking at diversity beyond just what was looked at for race and ethnicity. While important, it was also examining some of those other components. Some of the other interesting things that came out of the discussion were, taking a snapshot and look as far as the progress that's been made to date, especially with diversity action plans that have been submitted in accordance with the guidance that was issued. And some of the results that came out were really encouraging and promising, especially from the FDA arm for the oncology team members. And so I'll take a quick pause there before I keep going, but it was really, really, really exciting stuff. And I'd like to take a deeper dive if that's okay with you, Jessica.
Yes, I would love that.
All right. So some of the things to also note that were raised were, when looking at diversity in clinical trials and ways to improve it, first and foremost, they did visit the topic as far as, how to restore trust. So looking at the social determinants of health and how that matters and what that means, and pulling in the feedback from community leaders, physicians that work in community, and also just looking at everything holistically. And also dismantling the concept as far as structural racism and the need for race and ethnicity data. Some of the things that came to light were looking at how various countries in the developed world and really aren't even collecting race and ethnicity data to the full capacity. And so as we're looking at improving diversity in clinical trials in a holistic sense, and this is something that I think we tackle day in, day out, is, how can you make sure there's adequate representation when certain countries or regions aren't necessarily reporting or collecting that information in the same way. Not every region, not every country has the census, for example, where they're collecting this kind of data. So how can we ensure that there is proper representation if the data doesn't exist? And I think that's something that we'll touch on a little bit later, especially as we talk about the advent of AI and other technologies that could, help fuel and support it. But for example, in a traditional sense, only 6 of the 12 OECD countries collect race and ethnicity data in the traditional sense. And a total of 8 when you add in like Colombia and Costa Rica. The broad majority of the 36 OECD countries identified don't necessarily collect race and ethnicity status in the traditional sense. A lot of these regions and countries, so if you're looking at countries like France and Germany, they tend to collect what's considered migratory status, and where people may have immigrated from, but not necessarily collecting race and ethnicity in traditional sense. So those are things that we should bear in mind, especially as organizations are thinking about, well, how do I design for a diverse and inclusive study? When thinking through, what data is available, how should we start collecting it? What can we do to start challenging some of those other regulatory pieces to ensure adequate representation. But those are some of the interesting things and insights that came out from the discussion. So giving us a snapshot as far as what some of the greatest challenges folks are facing, especially as it pertains to diversity action plans that have been submitted to date. So for the oncology department, one of the biggest areas of note where people really were struggling were surrounding things like benchmarking enrollment rates for their diversity action plans. That's an area that received a lot of feedback from the agency. So I'll pause there to see if my fellow panelists have anything else that they'd like to add based on maybe some of their learnings as well from the discussion.
Yeah, no, I just, I think that you raise a really valid point about the availability of data. I would only add that I found it interesting, the discussion around indicators and ways that we can start to consider data, particularly the equation of PPR, the benefits and challenges of using prevalence to participation ratios, the introduction of newer potential indicators, including participation to consumption ratios, and really challenging, as you said, Ryan, the way we think about how much data can really be harmonized and what are some of the different ways that we can look at, say, migrant data and race data as proxies for other indicators, and really starting to kind of see this in a much more holistic way.
Okay, now, thank you both. We've now come to our first poll question. So how much emphasis is your organization placing on following and adjusting to the issued guidance? Responses are none, some, or significant emphasis. And we'll give the audience a moment to respond. Oh, wow. Okay, that's encouraging. We've got 50% saying a significant emphasis, 44% some, and just 6% none. Any thoughts on these results from our panelists?
I would just say stay encouraged. Each of us as organizations are working through a maturity model. And as these indicators and regulations emerge, we'll continue to work through that model. But the fact that actions are being taken and steps are being made is important.
For sure. Now, Tanea, we know better inclusion is needed, but there's still obviously many starts and stops along the way, causing delays in drugs becoming available, et cetera. Now, how could we move forward more aggressively with strategies that address the need for greater diversity?
I would say first and foremost, thinking about diversity in much the way that Ryan just mentioned as not a need. It's not a push for affirmative action in clinical trials, right? This is not a identify racial and sexual minorities and include them in trials. This is a commercial and therapeutic relevance exercise that is about the fair sharing of burden and benefit. It is emerging people-centered regulations that we're seeing around the globe. And as we interrogate these topics more and more, we understand that it's the right thing to do medically, scientifically, and ethically, and has tremendous benefit for health around the globe, as well as our business objectives. This is better science. This leads to faster and better data. And the ways that I think that we can begin to move in this direction more aggressively is to build equity and research into our healthcare systems and into the way that we collectively work together.
Okay, now, definitely something of a tall order. So what would a solid strategy look like for doing this? And are there any considerations that might apply to a smaller biotech versus a larger pharma that you could identify?
Sure. I'll start with your first question around what would be kind of the strategy. I think part one begins with our understanding what it is, what it isn't, and that there is no single answer. That it's really a context-specific endeavor that requires us to look at the entire clinical trial process. So this approach extends beyond looking at simple things like epi and starts to consider systems of access, ethnographic realities, intersecting determinants of health, really with a focus on widening patient access and obtaining better, more personalized data. So we're going to take a look at things like disparate impacts of disease, intersecting identities, mortality, diagnosis, access, experience. We need to start having conversations around data and its limitations. Data, while very important to this process, also the way we think about data. If we think just about, say, diabetes and prevalence, and we look at the countries in Europe that we would consistently include, and we compare that to, say, lower prevalence rates in Africa or the Middle East, when we compare the numbers, there are 33 million people in Pakistan with diabetes, but we don't have many trials there, right? And so we have to start to consider and imagine a process of evaluation and risk management plans in much the same way we have historically when we've needed to consider change. Are there suspected gaps in diagnosis? Does it serve to look at different diagnosis codes? Are there phenotypical differences in presentation? Have the claims data or other data that we often rely on in industry or registry data, are there gaps in it for people who are or underinsured, or are there issues there? So taking all of that into consideration and building a solid strategy that I think would include actionable steps and a methodology that gets incorporated across the process, formulating the research question, develop the individual design, budget, population, data collection, and analysis plan. Within organizations, each of these groups have their own particular set of priorities, well-established goals, performance indicators. So this is one of the reasons why adoption of this really requires hyper-focus, because it's a cross-functional endeavor. So we've got to have a perspective on a few things. What is the potential cost benefit of adoption? What is the context or consequence to your organization? And how does that impact things like goal setting? Is it compliance, revenue, sales, market, commercial? What is the hierarchy of business benefit? And this has to be set by leadership. Once you set that by leadership, you can then start to look at applying a methodology with a nucleus or a central team with a set of objectives to manage the tentacles into the rest of the organization that needs to be implementing these changes. Perhaps you'll work with biometrics on what Ryan mentioned, the collection of SDOH data, or how do we harmonize demographic data. Perhaps you'll work with data science on a list of questions or to consider outputs and develop the plan. Maybe it's your clinical study management for hyper-local recruitment plans or tailored population engagement strategies. Each team has to understand the latest developments, indicators, and considerations and how that may apply. And we have to have a plan for a system of evaluation, performance, and accountability as well. So that may mean partnering with new partners. Perhaps you need health intelligence data or you don't have the capacity. Perhaps you need an expert on outcomes or to help ID new additional sites or in the risk management of those. So I would say it's broad and far-reaching, and those are some considerations that I would recommend.
Tanea, I'm really glad that you raised that. And Jessica, I just want to build on that because I know that
Sure.
there's some folks that have dialed in that might be 2 people in a compound or smaller biotechs, and they are overwhelmed or they feel like they can't tackle this challenge earlier on in the development planning stages or, it's trial execution. And all of those reasons that Tanea mentioned, coupled with the fact that as an industry, we are facing a significant shortage, research suggests, with clinical research professionals in the workforce, and there's high degrees of turnover and just not enough professionals in the current format. Up to 95% of cancer centers recently reported having significant staffing issues. which suggests that we should start looking at building and going to new places and helping support the infrastructure development of community health centers and looking at transforming the model. And so that way we can reach the patients that need it most, which ultimately, if you're enrolling the right patients, that should help accelerate your development timelines.
Right.
So it's an industry need. It's not just because it's good science, it's the right thing to do. From a market standpoint, we as an industry are challenged. So I see some head nodding from my panelists. So
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Which leads me to the second part of the question, Ryan, right? Which is what are we seeing with smaller biotechs versus maybe larger established organizations? And certainly I think smaller biotechs, and if you're a two-person team, you've got a single asset, you need a situationally narrow approach, right? With an intelligent, specific plan, right sized to your need and goal. You may need literature reviews. You may need someone to draft your diversity action plan. Fine, there are partners that can help you do that. What I'm seeing is within pharma, there's more established relationships with these expectations. We're interested in building structure more suitable to delivering the pipeline, expecting service providers to engage with them earlier in the process than we've seen historically, and as more of a collaborative partner, taking accountability and ownership to drive this than other areas than we've seen historically where there are tactical services provided.
Okay, great. And now, what role, if any, could the decentralization of clinical trials potentially play in helping make this happen?
Yeah. Absolutely. I would say decentralization has many meanings. We often think about telehealth, but this could mean any number of things. This could mean an MRU in a neighborhood near you. That's a mobile research unit. This could mean the identification of patients through healthcare systems or the identification of sites through using previous clinical databases. There are a lot of ways that decentralization is providing access for patients. This also could be things like wearables. This could be things like local labs in your neighborhood. When we think about the inclusion of women, for example, I often say decentralization is a key to participation because women are telling us that time is limited. So we have to really be specific and listen to what patients are saying are their barriers to access, barriers to participation, barriers to trust, and utilize decentralized and other mitigating factors to address those and mitigate those barriers.
Okay, for sure. And it's time for our second poll question. So this one actually has two parts. So is your organization enabled by the right data and technology today to build and operationalize DEI locally? And the answers are yes, somewhat, or not at all. We'll wait for our results and then share part two. Okay, we have somewhat the greatest proportion, 55% chose somewhat, 25% say not at all, and 20% say yes. Now, for part two, how about globally? Is your organization enabled by the right data and technology to build and operationalize DEI on a global level? Okay, again, somewhat, 53%. Then we have 29% saying not at all and 18% yes. So any thoughts from our panelists on this? Is this
Yeah,
surprising or?
Just one. It's not surprising. What it means is people are really thinking critically about the gaps in the data that exist. What I would leave you with is if you are, no matter where you are in your maturity process, we know that some things are working. Those things are choosing the right sites with geographic and demographic relevance and having specific plans for an inclusive trial experience. Those things can be done globally with the right intersection of data analysis. And we're seeing more and more when we make these efforts to be inclusive and build these experiences, not only are we seeing increased relevant populations and trials, we're seeing increased enrollment rates overall and trials coming in sooner. So it behooves us all sometimes to think about this early, invest early into the process, and have a positive impact on your overall timelines and goals.
Okay, great. Now, Bill, we've yet to hear from you. What would you say is the most striking finding in evaluating diversity in novel drug approvals over the past 2 years?
We looked at the approvals by the FDA of novel new drugs over the last 2 years, 2022 and 2023, and there were 92 total drugs approved during that period of time. And a lot of interesting findings, but I think the most striking to me was that 18 of those 92 drugs, or 20%, have no Black participants who receive the novel new drug in their pivotal trials. 0. And I think that that's just astounding. It should be shocking, and it should be a call to action that something needs to change. And that's 20% of our novel new drugs with no Black participants. And if you look at the median across those 92, you might say, oh, those 18 just an outlier. The median number of Black participants in pivotal trials across those 92 drugs is 6. So if you can put the participants around your dinner table, it's probably too few to be representative in a approval of a new drug in the United States.
Absolutely. That is a shocking statistic, and it's good these changes are being made. Now, how should companies be thinking about measuring their outcomes and compliance with these new guidelines?
Yeah, I think that it's important for us to take a step. Right? Right now, the new guidelines are not mandatory, but they will be probably next year by the time all the final guidance comes out. But it can be a very overwhelming process, but it's important to take the first step in that journey. And what I've seen historically, what companies have done is collected demography, compare the balance between two treatment groups to ensure there's not imbalance in the demography, and pretty much just gone that far. They really haven't. That one of the things they struggle the most with is setting targets, right? Is it adequate? How do you know whether your representation is adequate? And I think you have to take the step of setting those targets. I know that companies are hesitant to do that, but that's an important component. And then measure yourself along the way against those targets. I think one of the technologies that can be most useful now and is pretty simple is simply understanding what's happening in the enrollment in your trial as it's underway. I don't think it takes fancy technology to do what the basics are here, but you really need to understand set your target, understand how your enrollment is going, and make adjustments along the way if it's not going the way it needs to go. And I think that's kind of the blocking and tackling simplistic thing we have to start with.
Okay, great. Now, let's go to our final poll question. Does your organization have a sound, effective way to set targets or goals for diversity in trials? We've got yes, somewhat, or not at all. Okay, we've got our results. Somewhat among 47% of respondents, and then we have yes among 31% and not at all for 22%. Any thoughts on these results?
I think actually it's very encouraging that 31% have yes. Maybe somewhat biased selection of the people who participate in this type of webinar. There's probably a lot out there who don't, but that's a great first step. What I would say, and one of my core messages is share your best practices. If you're doing that, fantastic. We applaud you. Teach the rest of us how to do it if you're doing it, even if it's not perfect, right? We're all learning along this continuum. So I think it's encouraging to see that, because that's oftentimes the most courageous step you have to take, to set a target and then measure yourself against that.
Correct.
Right.
And I would just add that, and thank you for that. I would add that the agency and no agencies have released an equation or a specific guidance on how to do this. And so to Bill's point, taking the step to build an algorithm or an approach is wise, and there's not a necessarily a wrong way to do it. But the activity needs to be done. And once the guidance is filed and finalized, there is going to be an expectation for transparency reporting. So taking the steps now to understand what's happening in your trial, during your trial, is wise and sound advice.
Yeah.
I
And
agree.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. It's okay. And I think it takes the proactivity to have the conversations with the agency, submit what you have based on your best assumptions. There is no perfect guidance right now. And so on the one hand, while it can be frustrating because we're creating and innovating and we're a very risk averse industry. We really want to make sure we're doing everything exactly so. But right now, this is an area that's it's developing, and you're a part of the development by submitting, by having the baselines, and by having the courage to have the discussions with the agency, submitting what you have. It actually helps us progress the conversation, and you can get the right feedback and guidance, so that way we can be better informed as the plans continue to grow. So be encouraged. take the chance. It's okay right now, is what I would also say.
Yeah, I imagine it could be paralyzing with, being compliance minded and having to sort of go on this new sort of journey. Now, Bill, you mentioned the role of technology in enrollment. What other potential roles could technology play in being adherent and ensuring greater diversity in trials?
Yeah. I think one of the areas that we actually have poor data on is the epidemiology of rare diseases. And I think we need to improve from that standpoint, and technology can help us there. So Tanaya referenced the PPR, the participation, the prevalence ratio, and oftentimes, whether it's the ICER group or the group in Yale has talked about a target of greater than 0.8. And what you're trying to do is saying, how many do you have in your trial in terms of a percent versus how does it impacted in the population with that disease or condition? But more than half of the drugs we have approved in the United States are rare diseases. And we don't actually have, when I've looked at it, we don't have that data to understand what is that prevalence in the demographic subgroups, because it's no longer saying what's the prevalence of non-small cell lung cancer by race or ethnicity. It's non-small cell lung cancer with a specific mutation of ROS or EGFR or something. And you get down to these very small, rare groups that we're developing drugs for, which is phenomenal, but we actually don't have the data to be able to use that. So I think one of the areas that we need to do is advance the epidemiology of understanding the rare diseases where we're developing drugs. And oftentimes, if we're just looking at previous trials or publications, all we're doing is perpetuating the bias of underrepresenting people in those past publications, right? So we have to be careful of that. So I think we can advance the science and technology on that end that help us better understand these diseases and conditions we're studying with our new novel drugs.
Okay. And could you talk about some validated ways of approaching measurement, as well as share about your validated scoring mechanism?
Sure. I think certainly the PPR, as I mentioned, is a valid way that's been published and discussed. And I would encourage people to look at that as well when they can. But again, I found that a lot of circumstances, I can't utilize it. And there's no magic, I would say, to the 0.8. It's just a number that's chosen, right? But those things tend to be just etched in stone then. So please look at that carefully. 0.8 isn't a magical number that we have to hit. It could be higher, it could be lower. What we've done in terms of our scoring system is looked at the participation compared to the census population. We've looked at the absolute number of patients in a subgroup who are receiving the novel new drug, and then also looked at the incidence or prevalence of the disease or condition in those subgroups in a semi-quantifiable way. Is it increased? Is it similar? Is it decreased compared to the comparator, meaning a white, younger male population, and to understand whether there's increased or decreased prevalence. So we built in all three of those factors. The one thing I would stress that's, again, not necessarily included in something like a PPR that we look at is it's really important for us to understand safety signals in subpopulations. That's different than hypothesis testing on the efficacy. And as I mentioned, if you have on average, six participants in a subgroup in a trial, your likelihood of picking up a very common adverse event that occurs in greater than 10% of patients is very, very low. So we look at, can you detect a 10% incidence adverse event? Meaning, do you have at least 30? Can you pick up a 1%? Still a common adverse event. You need 300. I think that's an important thing from a safety perspective that we're sometimes ignoring, and really important for some of the populations that we're looking at. So I think so the bottom line is combining the census comparison with the absolute number treated with a novel new drug, along with understanding the epidemiology of the disease or condition. And we combine those three, and then we look at 5 different groups: age greater than 60, female sex, Asian or Black race, and then Hispanic ethnicity, and look at a score across each of those and then combine it for a total score.
Okay. Now, Ryan, as we saw in our poll question results, some organizations are just getting started with all this. So are there reasons to prioritize these efforts?
Absolutely, Jessica. First and foremost, a major reason to enhance and focus on these efforts is just by sheer volume, right? If study opportunities are able to be offered to broader populations of the affected population, by default, you should be able to matriculate more of the right participants in, just at a baseline before you even start to get to various areas of like mistrust, challenges, and cultural competency, and so on and so forth. But just looking at, if you have a broader funnel of patients, in theory, you should be able to recruit. So this is definitely something that should be a focus if folks want to accelerate enrollment. Potentially, this is definitely something you might want to consider. From a scientific standpoint, it's really good science. As Bill shared earlier regarding recent approvals of various drugs and the fact that there is a lack of representation, and similarly for a lot of lung disease trials, for example, right, over 95% of populations were those of European male descent, even though certain indications like asthma disproportionately impact folks that are Black. So you really want to make sure that the drugs are safe and effective in the populations you wish to treat. And then from a bottom line standpoint, as an organization, you really should think about this when you're developing your commercial development plan, even if you're early stage on. If you have the right incidence prevalence and you can prove and share like, hey, we've observed that this drug could be effective in these various populations, and speaking to investors, it gives you greater targets, especially as we're looking at personalized medicine and being able to have the confidence in knowing that you're able to reach the right populations with your compound, it could improve your valuation and consideration, especially during tough, challenging financial times. And also those that are on the later stage of it, you really should focus on it, especially as we've seen recent reimbursement challenges that organizations have faced through CMS, who are enacting the evidence-based reimbursement policy sometimes across some of these various new approvals. When you've invested so much on the front end to do the clinical trial, and if you can't realize your investment through commercialization and you're being asked to redo studies because you did not capture the appropriate population and you're at risk of not getting reimbursed, that impacts the bottom line in a very significant way. And so, for all those reasons, from the fact that it's good science, the fact that it could potentially accelerate your development, and the fact that at the end of the day, the most important component is we really want to make sure that the drugs we're developing are safe and effective for the patients impacted. And when we say patients, I'll put my hand up and say myself included, right? We're people. So it's not just X's and O's in some chart that lives in some faraway land. They're us, they're our neighbors. So those are some of the key reasons why, from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from my fellow panelists if there's anything else you'd like to double click on.
I think you rounded that out quite well.
Yes, absolutely. Now, let's go to our audience for a bit and take some of their questions as well. Now, okay, this one is for Bill. What advice do you have for someone who's trying to understand how to read, understand, and utilize study data as it relates to increasing diverse representation?
And so I think there's lots of pieces that are now being published out there. And so it can be, there's a lot of information that's in little pieces in the public domain. But I do think some of the FDA guidance document, the draft guidance that exists, does a nice job in just a few pages to summarize some of the key issues. And then that can be a starting point for going into other directions. But what I find is that a lot of people are working this area, they want to help others. So once you see people on these types of calls, reach out to them when you're struggling and say, what do you do in this situation? How do I do this? Because there isn't any specific playbook now. And as mentioned, no right or wrong way. But I would start with the FDA guidance documents and then let that lead you into other areas. A really key part of this that I would stress is understanding your drug and understanding the disease or condition. Your drug meaning, does your drug, is it metabolized by an enzyme that has a polymorphism that's racially or ethnically dictated to some extent? That's an important component, right? Drug metabolizing enzymes are important. So start with the science, understand the epidemiology as well of your disease. Those are really the core things to do. If you know your drug well and you know your disease or condition well, you're going to be able to do a much better job at this. And there's no right or wrong, but take the first step in the journey.
Okay, anything to add? Anyone? All right, well, let's move on. We've got one for Tanea. Are there clear steps to follow that can help align the entire organization around building out impactful DEI plans and thinking about change management when it comes to looking at data differently, employing insights differently, and measuring outcomes differently?
Yeah, yes. I would say, follow a well-planned, typical change management process that includes early stakeholder engagement, ticklers, training, and other things. But also, utilize the industry guidances. We just mentioned the guidance itself. If you've read the guidance released in November of 2020, it is very specific on the questions that it expects us to answer in our diversity action plans and in the way that we approach the clinical trial process. MRCT and other industry stakeholders have produced a wealth of training and guidance documents. Start with what's established. FDA and CTTI has also released last year a maturity model for organizations to adopt, with elements to understand, where you should be versus where you are now, and where you should track towards. And once you get through those things, you understand what the requirements are and the questions that need to be asked at every point during the clinical trial process. When you have understood that, you can then build a methodology that's appropriate for your organization with a RACI and a set of expectations, that really formalizes and builds this into the way that you work. You're going to need to divide this into areas of quick wins, right? Short, medium, and long-term goals. Don't let the long-term expectation plans stop you from implementing the quick wins now. And have a plan to get you to some of those longer term goals, but certainly a methodology that really lays out by department, by stage of trial, by stakeholder within your organization, and what those expectations are, can be developed and should be developed, to help us integrate this into the way that we work.
Okay, great, thank you. And Ryan, this one's for you. How should we evaluate technology to enable us along our journey to build out DEI plans?
Thanks, Jessica. That's a really good question, because it could be, I'll call it overwhelming, right? When you're getting started and you're trying to figure out where to begin. So I would say, first and foremost, start with the guidance as your kind of framework to understand, okay, what are the pieces that maybe we currently have access to, and then what are our gaps? So I would say start as an organization with a gap analysis to identify existing sources, so that way you can be a really good steward of the resources that you're investing when it comes to identifying and better understanding like what your true needs are when it comes to being able to build out the plans. Some of the other pieces that I would look for are, does the data provider that you're looking at or assessing, do they have access to claims? Like, how can they best support patient counts? So that way you can fulfill some of the requirements as far as benchmarking for your studies. How vast and robust is the data, and does it align with what your clinical development areas of interest are, from a commercial standpoint, and also from a study standpoint. I would also say that, as you're evaluating, perhaps you should also look at and evaluate if the vendors have capabilities to provide insights beyond just race and ethnicity data of what's available in the census, right? Are there opportunities for further enhancement where this diversity data is informed by social determinant insights, such as income levels, education levels, gender, that you can also utilize to get really good insights that should inform what your patient engagement strategy could and should be, and the kinds of conversations that need to be had. And then also, evaluating your data partners, look at what kind of insights on diversity might they have beyond just the patient population, but also the providers that are treating said patients. Do these PIs speak certain languages that would actually be very supportive in your ability to connect in a very authentic way with the patient populations you wish to enroll? Does the doctor, for example, speak Spanish, and is that known, and how do you translate all of that? So all of those are just some good food for thought and baseline. So first and foremost, do a gap analysis as an organization. The second part is making sure that your data strategy is informed by the needs of your organization, informed by the diversity action plan, and then look at, for the investment, what are the regions? Do those regions align with where you want to go? Do you actually need diversity data for the Netherlands? I don't know if you do, but only you know that as a company, right? So being really informed by where you want to go and making sure that it can support your needs and helping you fulfill the requirements. So those are just some food for thoughts as far as some very high level baseline things that you can do when evaluating. And does that data provide insights both on diversity of patients and providers?
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is support that data evaluation with some understanding of the landscape as well. So if we know that implicit bias impacts not only investigator-patient relationships, but also investigator-investigator relationships, so networks and referrals, referrals by sex and race and socioeconomic status. So when you have the foundational knowledge with which to evaluate the data, it makes the data that much more useful.
Okay, great. Now, Ryan, does H1 have race and ethnicity data on a global scale?
So H1 does, and actually H1 was a thought leader in this space and made heavy investments to obtain this data before it was super popular. So the short answer is yes, race and ethnicity data globally is available for the UK, Brazil, and the US. And these insights do encompass PI insights along with patients and some of those referral partners and networking, so that way you can see maybe we should look and evaluate this site versus that one and figure out ways to connect the dots between the two. So yes.
Okay, fantastic. Now I'll just sort of lob this out to the group and see who wants to grab it. But sounds like they're speaking about a specific study. The sites have recruited in the region with high minority population, but still the sites cannot recruit many minority patients. So there are additional barriers existing, as we discussed earlier, such as minority willingness to participate in trials. Can anyone speak to, some ways to tackle these barriers?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab if I can. One thing that I did just mention is implicit bias. I think that's very important. So we need to understand that everyone is not, just because a site exists, everyone is not having the same experience or relationship to that site. So as Ryan mentioned, presence of staff cultural competency, language, accessibility, all of those things at the site itself should be interrogated for perhaps maybe there are some reasons why there's a lack of engagement. Other issues, truly, lack of trust does exist. There has been historical harm done to some communities around the globe by research. We know that. It behooves us to have proactive, non-transactional relationships with communities to build that relationship and increase trust. But by the time we've made it to the trial, we really have to help enable our sites as well. So not just what's happening internally, but do they have a budget to reach into the community that they haven't reached before? Are they prepared for questions that might arise around cost, insurance, lack of, are we prepared to answer those questions and mitigate those other known barriers, logistical and otherwise, that exist? So you may be in a really diverse site, but you may not have mitigations or taken the right steps to mitigate those barriers that are existing.
I'm really glad that you raised that, Tanea, and having worked with Community Site Network, I'm just nodding my head over here. Identifying where the folks are is one part of the problem. At the end of the day, it's all about relationships, right? And you really have to make a concerted effort as an organization, depending on your funding, the study that you're working on. How can you become a true partner of the site? A great tool that you can start with is SCRS's validated tool, the DSAT, to begin with, for example, to really understand what a site may need, if there are gaps in investments that they might need, and really listen and figure out, are there ways that we can align? And you also have to take the time to galvanize these communities and support the teams as well, and having the right tools to be able to engage in these conversations. There are a host of great resources, but also requires accountability, both from your side and also at the site level, to ensure that these practices are being taken consistently. A very simple thing, and there's the Just Ask initiative that's been started, but 95% of the time, why minority participants aren't participating are because they are not asked. So you got to ask. And I know it can be uncomfortable, it can be scary, but encouraging your site staff members and doing the role playing, empowering them with the right resources to have the intelligent conversations, aligning translators or other resources that might be needed, and ensuring that you've got the appropriate understanding of the community. So try to engage them in the dialogue before the protocol is finalized.
Okay, and as far as the ask, I mean, is this just happening in the physician office, or is this outreach in the community to build these relationships?
It's a holistic effort. Tanea, what are your thoughts?
I was going to say the same. I would say it's both, and both are necessary.
Okay, great. It looks like our time is starting to wind down, so I want to leave enough time for us to wrap this up with our guests who have shared such valuable insights. Why don't we take a few moments each to share your top 3 suggestions about what is needed, what's most needed to advance health equity in clinical trials for 2024. Bill, would you like to start?
Sure. My top 3, number 1 would be incentivize. I think we work too much on the stick and not enough on the carrot. And when I say incentivize, means if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're hiring a CRO to do your trials, incentivize them to enroll a diverse population, right? They're going to do what they're incentivized to do. And oftentimes we only say time and money, enroll as fast as you can for the lowest budget you can. Incentivize them to enroll diverse populations. The other part of the incentive I think that needs to come is from policymakers and legislators. We're going to have a guidance from the FDA that says diversity action plans are mandatory for pivotal trials. Imagine a world where if not only we have those plans, but if the sponsor hit the targets that are in those plans, they receive priority review of their NDA or BLA. I guarantee you that the pharmaceutical companies would do everything they can to hit those targets. Because right now, even though we set the targets, there's nothing that happens if we don't hit them. Incentivize them to hit their targets after they're set. And we can do that from a policy perspective. For instance, in priority review of their applications. I think that's an important part. Second thing is, as I mentioned, share your best practices. There are so many small companies. The large companies have people who do this full time, which is phenomenal. But most of the small biotechs and startup companies don't have the bandwidth to do that. Help them on this journey that we all are passionate about and believe in. And the third thing that I would push is onshore your clinical trial sites. Rob Califf last year at the JP Morgan talked about onshoring, meaning bringing more trial sites into the US. When I looked again across all these drug approvals, the median percent of patient enrollment that comes from the United States is 29%. So we can do everything we can to do a better job on those 29% enrolling a diverse population. But if 70+% of enrollment is coming from non-US sites, how are we going to expect that to be reflective of the US population? So and again, that's a thing that we work with CROs and say it's a time and money issue and where the patients are. But we have to move that. I think not enough people are talking about bringing more trial sites into the US so it's reflective of the US population.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. And Tanea, would you like to share?
Sure. I would say number 1 is education. To truly understand when we say diversity in clinical trials, what does that mean? What is the context relevance to your asset, to your trial, to your organization? What is the hierarchical need? Really understanding the details of that, and also understanding, as Bill just sort of alluded to, what are the global priorities? Where is this going to become a rate limiting factor or a something to impact the bottom line? Is it just in the US where we know that the FDA has this diversity guidance, or can we look at the recent release of anticipated guidance by MHRA on this topic? They just came out in November. So really looking at this as a global priority and not something limited to just the US and maybe where we have a unique historical relationship to race, and also centering the US in the discussions around race and ethnicity. All of that will come with education. So that's priority number 1. Number 2 is to partner As Ryan mentioned, there are lots of companies that exist now to help all of us fill gaps, and there are many gaps. There are companies, networks that are coming together to increase our reach into rural communities or into immigrant communities, if we're speaking globally, who have historically been completely lacked access. Within a particular country, there are usually groups working to ensure that we have the socially deprived gaining access, or particular patient communities now, or communities around therapeutic area or disease. They're starting to now, whereas advocacy before was a very homogenous space, there are groups now that that exist pertaining to specific populations who have been underserved. Partner with them and partner early in the process. As we mentioned, this has to start to happen well before you get to the point of writing your protocol. And tack into other partnerships, government and other stakeholders, Moonshot, Healthy 2030, the ethics community has a whole set of goals around this as well. Partner with people who are doing the work to really develop that end-to-end goal. And then finally, prioritize. You have to decide as an organization with your leadership and understand the hierarchical priority that this has, and invest as a result, and whatever that means to your organization. Those would be my top three. And I really do hope that that you partner with us on this journey. We would hate to continue to see trials, 80% of trials that cancel are canceled because lack of participation, lack of enrollment. As we said, when we build an inclusive trial experience, when we build this into the way that we work, the benefit is for all.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanea. Ryan, we're running very well. We're probably over, but if you could.
Look, this is a phenomenal group of panelists, and thank you so much for our host. The only closing thing I would say is collaborate, leverage technology, and execute, and invest and incentivize and empower. So making sure that you align your internal political capital towards this, and you incentivize teams to be supported when they take steps towards innovation. So collaborate, reach out, and we can achieve some really powerful things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. I appreciate your time and your wonderful insights. Thank you to H1 for sponsoring this fantastic event. Audience, please, if you wouldn't mind filling out our brief survey afterwards, and thank you all for attending.